All right, let's kick it off. Welcome to today's webinar on the EU forced labor regulation. About 5 weeks ago, the European Commission published first set of guidelines, and today we want to give you insights as to how forced labor can be addressed in supply chains, what it really is, but also what the regulation and these guidelines really mean for companies. And to do that, I'm joined by Markus Löning and Sebastian Ruenz from Taylor Wessing. And we have an agenda prepared for you today with first an overview onto the EU forced labor regulation by Sebastian Ruenz, then an in-depth look on forced labor, risk hotspots from Markus, and then I will end with the solution approach to identifying forced labor in supply chains. And we will end with a Q&A section. Before we get started, we will send the slides to everybody. The webinar will also be recorded, and you have the opportunity to ask questions already throughout the webinar with the QA section of the webinar that you should see in front of you. And with that, maybe as a quick introduction, so the EU forced labor regulation is one of several frameworks that encompass forced labor as part of due diligence for companies, but also for supply chains. We have the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act in the US. We have other country-specific legislation, such as the UK Modern Slavery Act, but also in Canada and Norway and Australia, we have dedicated legislations, but we also have the broader frameworks, such as the German Supply Chain Act, but also the CSDDD, which also encompass forced labor as part of a general human rights due diligence approach. So forced labor is really included in due diligence frameworks throughout. And today we want to focus more specifically on the European forced labor regulation. And to give us now a look into what this regulation precisely means, I would like to hand over to Sebastian to give us an overview there. Thank you.
Thanks, Harald. So let's start with the timeline first. The forced labor regulation will apply from December 2027. So we have about 1.5 years left. Let's take a look what happened so far and what will still happen in the meanwhile. So interesting fact is that the forced labor regulation hasn't been part of the Omnibus proceedings, which started last year. So we saw a lot of simplifications entering various laws like CSDDD or CSRD and so on, but the forced labor regulation was not covered. We assume that's because there are no new due diligence obligations theoretically included in the forced labor regulation, and that's why the legislator thought, okay, well, we don't have to touch this in the Omnibus proceedings. By now, we should already know the designated authorities responsible for enforcement of the forced labor regulation in the member states, but unfortunately, there are just some member states that indicated the authorities responsible. Most of the member states, they have no official authority designated for the enforcement of the forced labor regulation. What Harald already mentioned is a couple of weeks ago, guidelines were published. They were leaked before, but now we have the complete set of guidelines with statements on how the companies should cooperate with the authorities, what the authorities actually do to enforce the forced labor regulation. There should be a database by now that should have been published also by mid of June this year, but unfortunately there is a delay This database basically contains sectors, products where forced labor, according to authorities, can be seen often. And this is, of course, something companies under the scope of this regulation are waiting for, because this then gives an indication which are the supply chains, according to the authorities, where you should focus on. Very often the question arises, what do you think? Will there be a delay of the forced labor regulation? I haven't heard anything in this regard. And when you look at what is happening on an international level right now, probably not, because the Trump administration, for example, they imposed tariffs on more than 80, on around 80 countries of 10% incoming goods, because those countries, according to the Trump administration, are not doing enough against forced labor, which is kind of funny, but not the focus of our today's webinar. But this shows that there might be developments that are probably surprising, which then could also lead to the situation that the forced labor regulation will come into effect by the end of next year, and that there won't be any delays. If we go to the next slide, we can see the key elements of the forced labor regulation. And maybe just as a statement up front, from our perspective, the forced labor regulation could be a game changer in the enforcement of ESG obligations. Why is that? Because so far, most legislation obliged companies to use their best efforts to reduce human rights violations. But the forced labor regulation requires a success of the companies. So no matter what you have been doing in due diligence measures, in the end, you have to guarantee that your products are forced labor free. And if they are not, then they will be subject to a market ban. You cannot sell the products anymore, no matter what your measures to reduce forced labor have been. So this, of course, as a consequence, could be very strong, very problematic consequence for the companies, because then in the end, if one part contains forced labor and this part is used for the production of another product, then potentially the whole production could stand still. That's why it's so important in the end to comply with forced labor regulation. Besides, we have a large scope, so there is no threshold. Basically, every company importing, exporting products into the and out of the EU is a subject to the forced labor regulation. Of course, only if you have a forced labor risk in your supply chain. Then you would need to do something. We will take a closer look at what this exactly is. But it affects a lot of companies. And of course, the forced labor regulation primarily contains provisions on how the investigation process from the authorities will look like. On the next slide, we showed basically give you a short overview on how the structure of the forced labor regulation looks like and what it covers, what it doesn't cover. Online distance retail is covered. So if you're offering your products in the EU online, so you're targeting EU end users, then those sales, online sales or distance selling sales will be covered by the regulation. Both state-imposed and privately ordered forced labor is covered by the regulation. The regulation does not oblige companies to take back products that already reached the end customer. If they are still on the way to the end customer, then you would need to recall them. But if they are already sold to the end customers, there is no obligation to recall them from the end customers. And also important, only products are covered. So forced labor that is part of the product, but not forced labor that can be found in services like transporting, warehousing, logistics. So this is also something important to mention. When we look at the consequences of the EUDR, of the forced labor regulation, on the next slide, we gave you an overview, already mentioned it, market ban. This is a very strong enforcement measure the authorities basically could take. If the product is strategically important for the EU, then there is an option that there is no market ban combined with the obligation to dispose of the product, but instead an obligation to hold back the product until the company proves that there is no forced labor included in the product. Then after that, a company could again sell the product. But of course, probably this will be the exemption, and the standard case will be that there is a market ban, so that, for example, custom authorities suspend shipments at the border, and the company is not allowed to sell the products anymore and needs to present a plan how to dispose of the products. If you don't comply with this procedure, then there might be penalties. Penalties are not regulated in the forced labor regulation itself, but the member states need to basically decide what would be adequate penalties. The guidelines published by the EU Commission already give some indication. So as we already know from other legislation, there might be a certain value of your turnovers that could serve as a criteria for the fines. And decisions on forced labor violations are also published on a portal from the EU Commission, so you also have the public exposure if you don't comply with the decisions of the EU Commission or national authorities. So, but now let's take a closer look of how this whole process looks like and what companies have to do. Let's start from the beginning. So the authorities first have to decide what are the forced labor cases we want to prioritize and want to take a closer look at. Therefore, they will use the following 6, let's say, references or data points. So they will have a information communication system for market surveillance. There you can find all the ongoing investigations. So company authorities are able to and have to cooperate with each other over the member states and thereby collect data on cases that are severe or should be prioritized. Then, as mentioned in the beginning, there will be a database. So the authorities will provide a database with forced labor supply chains or supply chains where they think forced labor is imminent and where companies should take a closer look. Then we have, of course, the option that third parties approach the authorities. As we know from other legislation, complaints mechanism from the authorities where third parties can present cases of forced labor, then of course this will be another source for the authorities. And there might be own studies, analysis, tools the authorities will use. Then, and this we can see on the next slide, the authorities have to decide which products, which companies in a certain supply chain with high forced labor risks should we approach. Therefore, also in the guidelines, we can find a risk-based approach, also in Article 14, where it is basically described what are the criteria for prioritization, which is particularly severe cases of forced labor or companies which are economically strong and which have greater leverage and are closer to the suspected forced labor violation, and high volumes of products that should be made available on the EU market, and so on. So the authorities will look at all this information. What are the most important supply chains? Who are the most important actors in this supply chain? Where do we have the severe cases? And then in the end, they will decide, okay, this is our main focus for the moment. And on the next slide, we can see what they will do. Then they will start with a preliminary investigation followed by a formal investigation. So this is basically 2 steps. In the preliminary investigation, they will request information from the company they want to approach. The company then has only 30 days, which is very important to remember, because it's not it's unlike other legislation where you have more time to collect data you think is interesting for the authorities. You have 30 working days to basically present information to the authorities so that the authorities don't have a substantiated concern. If you are able to do that, then the investigation stops and is basically concluded. If you are not able to do that, then the authorities will initiate formal investigation. The second step in this formal investigation, the authorities will then require more detailed data from the companies, probably more details on traceability, on suppliers, on due diligence measures. And again, you have 30 to 60 with the possible extension, 60 working days to establish that there is no forced labor in your products. And again, either the authorities come to the conclusion, okay, we cannot prove any forced labor in the products, or according to our view, there is forced labor in the products, and the company wasn't able to prove the opposite, and then they would render a decision, as mentioned, market ban, and so on. The companies, of course, could then defend themselves against the decision, either by approaching the authorities one more time or by directly approaching a court, and then a court would have to decide whether the decision of the authority has been legitimate or not. And now on the next slide, for me, this is the most important, or let's say the next 2 slides are the most important slides of this, let's say my part of the presentation today, because now the most important question is, what do the authorities have to prove? And it is interesting that in the guidelines, this burden of proof is a little bit watered down compared to what the law says. The law says basically the burden of proof lies with the authority. So it is the authority that needs to prove there is forced labor in the supply chain. The guidelines explain in more detail how this looks in practice. And there we can see that the burden of proof doesn't mean that the authorities need to prove 100% that there is forced labor in the supply chain, because typically that's not possible. You will have certain evidence that certain indicators that speak for forced labor, and this is basically what the authorities rely on. So interviews they have been provided with, audit reports, photos, videos, documents, company records, satellite imagery, public reports, media reports, so not always extremely detailed information, but a whole set of information. And the authority basically has to come to the conclusion, based on this circumstantial evidence, we think there is forced labor in the supply chain, although they probably don't have a 100% proof. And then it's the company who needs to prove the opposite, who needs to provide evidence that makes it difficult for the authorities to say, well, there is forced labor in supply chain. So this leads us to basically three potential cases. One here on the right side, case one would be there is a 100% proof of forced labor because you have videos, interviews of the person who was obliged to work under forced labor, and this is 100% clear. Then, regardless of what the company has done, there will be a decision that the products manufactured with forced labor cannot be sold. But again, this will be the exception because typically there is no 100%. Then the second case will be the authorities, they don't have good proof at all because there might be a news report about potential forced labor in a supply chain, but nothing else. Then probably the authorities won't have enough evidence to come to the conclusion there's forced labor in the supply chain. Then again, it doesn't matter what the company has done to reduce forced labor, the authority won't be able to render a decision because there's basically just not enough evidence. But the standard case, and that's the most interesting thing on this slide, is that the authorities have certain indicators. They rely on these indicators and shift the burden of proof to the company, who then needs to explain themselves why these indicators are not true or are not reliable in their particular case. And what companies need to do to prove the opposite, we can see on the next slide. This is also mentioned in the guidelines. This is basically the information required from companies. So this is the information you need to have answers for. The guidelines distinguish three different topics. So the authorities might ask you questions on due diligence measures. They might ask you questions about working conditions at the place where forced labor is suspected, and they might ask you questions about the particular product, so traceability, where the product comes from, how the supply chain should looks like. And the more answers you provide, the less likely it is that the authorities will, in the end, render a decision forced labor in the supply chain. Other way around, if you don't have answers on these questions, then the authorities will probably rely on their evidence they have, even if it is not 100% evidence. But if you say, well, we have a due diligence measure, we send a supplier code of conduct to our direct suppliers, and that's it, then probably this won't be enough to disprove the evidence the authorities have. This means that you, in practice, other than sometimes published so far, need to do something under the forced labor regulation because a proper due diligence management, also in the deeper supply chain, information on traceability, on the different actors in the supply chain and the working conditions at the in the supply chain help you to gather enough evidence that you can oppose to the evidence the authorities collected. So this is why it is important to remember, and why those two slides are very important. The forced labor regulation in the end doesn't lead to the situation that you don't have to do anything. It leads to the situation that you have to do something. We will take a closer look at what this means for companies falling under other legislation like CSDDD and German Supply Chain Act, but also SMEs later on. But this is basically the important thing. The forced labor regulation doesn't force you to do something, but if you don't have answers to these questions here, then it is very likely that the authorities will come to the conclusion forced labor and supply chain, and then with all the consequences of market bans and so on. And with this, I hand over to Markus.
Sebastian, thanks a lot, and good afternoon, everyone. I saw there were quite a few very interesting questions also in the Q&A, very practical already. Thanks a lot for these questions. Not to all of them there is already a definite answer. I think Sebastian gave a great overview of how the authorities are going to work, and I think it's important as a non-lawyer to also say it is about evidence, but it is also about evidence for risk or indicators for risk. And there's a difference between let's say, I would say the legal term of evidence in front of a court and the indicator for a risk. That's important to understand. There were some questions around how far does an investigation go and so on. Some of this still has to be worked out and is not clear yet. So we're presenting today's knowledge. There's also going to be more disclosure, I guess, from the side of the European Union, and there will be more public debate also around that. Let me explain some of the more practical parts also, and of course also what is forced labor actually. So forced labor is defined by two conventions of the International Labour Organization, and the easiest way to understand it is this definition in ILO Convention 29, which says any work or service which is required under the threat of a penalty and which he or she has not voluntarily offered to perform. That's quite, I think, common sense is actually quite easy to understand. But there are different indicators. It's not always a black and white decision. There are different indicators for forced labor, which I'll be talking about shortly. So it can be any type of work-related activity. It can mean pressure or punishment as means of coercions, but there can also be other means of coercions like financial pressure. And at the end of the day is always the question, does the person that is in a forced labor situation have a real freedom of choice? Can they leave the workplace or not? That's one of the key questions. And I'll go a little deeper in the following slide. One thing that's important to understand, coming back to the ILO convention, is that these conventions have been signed and ratified by nearly all countries worldwide. So it is a worldwide standard that's applicable to basically all markets that we're dealing with. Now, we sometimes have a confusion about modern slavery and forced labor because some countries call their legislation Modern Slavery Act, like the UK, for example. So modern slavery is takes a larger perspective on situations where people are not free to choose, which includes, for example, also forced marriage. But that is not in the scope of this law. This law purely looks at labor-related forced labor. It is divided then again into state-imposed forced labor or forced labor by private actors, and it does include forced labor of children, which is one of the worst forms of child labor, which is also covered by other ILO conventions, and it's nearly always covered also by a national law. The same goes for forced labor. Nearly all countries have this kind of law in place. The problem is it's not being enforced by many countries. I'm not taking any country out there. So and what you see in this graph is what is actually covered by the EU forced labor regulation. So forced labor, either state-imposed or by private actors. It can be exploitation through forced labor, but then there's also, of course, commercial sexual exploitation of adults under duress. So also that is covered by the forced labor regulation. And let's look at the next slide. So these are the indicators that you can use to identify forced labor. These are indicators which are published by the ILO, so they are the standard to follow if you are identifying forced labor. Coming back to 4 main pillars here, the first one is recruitment and deception, which means that you have cases where people are being told you're going to get a fantastic job with great pay. Just pay me a certain amount of money. Just had cases in Germany, for example, where people in Vietnam and India were deceived in that way. They needed to pay 15,000 euro to agents that would then bring them to Germany. And instead of a highly qualified, well-paid job, they ended up in meat processing factories at being paid at the lowest level. So that is creating a deception there. It's telling people wrong things and bringing them into a situation where they cannot basically escape because they owe the money. They need to pay back the fee that they have paid, and they have been basically frauded into this situation. Second pillar of indications is control and restriction. So typically restriction of movement, isolation, document retention. Very often document retention is the one thing that is used. It's not that people are in compounds with barbed wire. It's more that the employer or the agent has the passport very simply and is sometimes also collecting the money. Pressure and coercion is intimidation, threats, physical violence. You can all imagine what that is, what that means. And then the last pillar are working conditions, issues like withholding wages, like you're going to get paid next week, next month, whatever. Debt bondage is what I was speaking about when I said people owe money to agents, saying, well, we paid for your transport, we did this and that, you owe us so and so much money. Abusive conditions like excessive overtime, dangerous working conditions, and so on. So these are the indicators that you should be looking out for. And as Sebastian was saying, due diligence is very important, due diligence of your suppliers. And you will need to look at the due diligence systems that you have in place, whether they are really looking at these 11 ILO indicators. On the next slide, I will give some examples to also show that it is not something that happens in faraway countries only. Forced labor happens in nearly basically all economies in different forms. I've just talked about forced labor allegations, which was taking place in Germany. That was public in German media. You have other kinds of forced labor in all sorts of countries regarding all sorts of industry. It can be anywhere. It can be in services, it can be in mining, it can be in the industry, and it can take basically in all countries. So don't think, oh, we're buying from country so-and-so, and actually that's a safe country. depending on your product, depending on the sector that you're procuring from, there might still be a risk. So take everything, all the possibilities into account. Unfortunately, that's the situation. You see an ILO figure here, 27 million people are estimated to be in a situation of forced labor currently, and that number is unfortunately not going down. So it is an urgent problem and it's an ongoing problem. Next slide. We're looking at some risk hotspots where things are known, where things are public, and where we did work on already. So coffee in Brazil is one of the situations that has been public. We've seen, especially in the south of Brazil, there were very bad allegations there, including working children. Same situation as always. People are brought to a place, it's far away, they're very remote, and they cannot get out of the situation for different reasons. I've recently seen a similar situation also in an Asian country in agriculture. Typically, remoteness and no legal title to be in the country are aspects that you have to look at. Also something you will find inside the European Union. Rare earth processing, solar modules, especially solar modules, there has been a lot of research on that. It's very well publicly known. It's seldomly addressed publicly because we all want the energy transition to move forward. And at the same time, we have a situation that solar modules are produced with the help of forced labor. And there's a lot of evidence for that. So that is going to be very interesting to see how the Commission is going to deal with the enforcement of this specific parts. Textiles, clothing is something that is not new as well. These are that's a general thing where forced labor is happening. It's very often in not so well qualified jobs that it's taking place. Textiles and clothing is a typical example for that. That they are in the case of India, it's very often women being forced into that, very often via debt bondage, saying, work for us for 2-3 years and you get paid at the end. And then they get fired 2-3 months before the end of the contract and get paid nothing. I've talked about agriculture, food processing, especially textiles, leather. It is all taking place inside the European Union as well. We've just had the recent cases in Italy where the public prosecutor is looking at companies that are producing luxury goods for global brands, very well known, that have situations of forced labor in Italy, actually. So it is everywhere, the risk is everywhere, and it means you always need to have a look. So what can we do? On the next slide, we're showing 2 examples of research that Prewave and Löning did together. So in that process, Prewave typically detects indicators that, okay, we have some indications for forced labor. On the left side, you're seeing a situation of rare earth elements in Myanmar. The north of Myanmar vast regions are in a civil war situation or armed conflict situation. So they are hard to access, dangerous to go there. And we have researched the situation where there have been these indicators. And in the north of Myanmar, that is Kachin State, close to the border to China. It's very isolated, armed groups and so on, informal working groups. And there's a lot of rare earth mining taking place, and the products of that are being processed in China. And there have been these allegations of forced labor. So we looked into it. We looked into publicly available information, which Prewave did. And then we reached out to our local contacts and validated this and verified the situation. So I remember having a conversation with a human rights defender that had just been to Kachin. He was just back in Yangon, and we had a long conversation over the phone, and he was describing the situation. And we had other sources, we talked to other people as well, but there from the conversations we had with people that had seen the situation on the ground, we came to the conclusion that there may be individual cases of forced labor, but it is not a prevalent problem. So there is no reliable information on coercion in these mines, but there are a lot of indicators for other human rights violations that are taking place. But the mining itself, let's say the work itself is done because people want to make the money. It is paid very well, so they go to these mines. Although, for example, there's strong health hazards and other situations that are very dangerous. So in that case, we could say, okay, it is not a mine that where we could say, this is without risk, but is the risk of forced labor specifically is not high. It's a low risk. We had a different situation when we were looking at mechanical engineering in Xinjiang. There again, there was some indications. There was a media report. There was information request by the German authority, BAFA. The risk factors is Xinjiang is known as a high-risk region. Anyway, so what we did there is we did an in-depth research of open source. That's a lot of the work that Prewave did. We looked at the sources, at the credibility of the sources, and then what we did is our expert looked at what do these findings actually mean in the Xinjiang context? What is the policy that applies? How is a policy that is public implemented? What are the streams of command? Who is actually in control? So one of the things we found out that this is a military administrated region where these companies were, which is a strong indication that the same military units that are running the camps are also in control of this region, which of course is a very high risk indicator. So it was one of the risk indicators we found others, but we could in that case, for example, confirm that there is a very high risk of forced labor. On the next slide, giving some more examples of this is another, just an example to also remind everyone that it takes crazy forms. Forced labor is completely unexpected. After with COVID hit in, we had a wave of forced labor in Southeast Asia in these scam factories, so-called scam factories, where thousands and tens of thousands, 220,000 people in total have been lured into working into these factories, which is basically trying to steal money from people online. And I've just read about the first case that they were trying to find people to work there in Germany as well. So it's not that this is just people from Vietnam, China, Thailand that are lured into these scam factories. It's actually spreading around, and it is a multi-billion business. So very hard to tackle. And the next slide has more examples. One example I find especially striking was that Decathlon was profiting from Uyghur forced labor. This was the allegation, and it was made public not so long ago. And so Prewave looked into their files and said, well, we could have told the company 9 years ago, actually, that there were indicators for this. So if you are using good open source intelligence, if you have a good risk management in place, you can find these indicators and go deep into them in a situation where you don't have the pressure of public attention yet. And I think that's very important to go. We have other examples here. We've got the Senate report. The US Senate is very active on the topic. We had the situation with Brazil, which is going back and forth with the BYD factory site. So again, we're talking about a lot of different situations, sectors, and so on. Let me give you one last example we have had an allegation, and that's part of this report as well. We've had one allegation which Prewave and we looked at together. There was an allegation against a supplier, car part supplier, which was selling to the US. And so we looked into it. What we found out is that this car part supplier has two subsidiaries, independent situations, two factories far away from each other. One of the factories we could not confirm. There was a low risk, there was a general regional risk there, but there was no indication of forced labor. In this case, Uyghur labor transfer program was taking place in this factory. In the other factory, on the contrary, we did find hard evidence. There was clear evidence in the open source information, but then also, because this was one of the cases that was published in the New York Times, I managed to speak to one of the journalists that did the research, and he told me he was actually in front of the factory and he asked the people at the gate, so where are the Uyghurs? And the people at the gate said, yes, they're back there. They're all there. So sometimes you do actually find very strong evidence. In that case, the client was happy because he was not procuring from this factory, but from the other factory. And we developed some program with them to deal with the risks there. So we will share this report, which gives some examples of how research is done, what you can expect, and how well you can actually assess the risk. And I think that's the kind of information that the authorities will want to see at the end of the day. So I believe that was my part. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Markus, for the fantastic insight. So yeah, let me now give you, as the final point on the agenda, insights into how these risk assessments and forced labor risks can be identified and addressed in supply chains. First of all, Markus mentioned it, also Sebastian mentioned it. The due diligence system is really the foundation, and it's also something the authorities look at. Due diligence system as laid out in the OECD guidelines, but also as formulated into some of the human rights due diligence regulations or legislation, such as the German Supply Chain Act or the CSDDD, follows these pillars or these 5 duties around risk management, governance, risk analysis and assessment, prevention and remediation measures, complaint procedure, oftentimes also reporting. But this is the foundational system that needs to be in place. For assessing risks, yes, we have the risk-based approach, and that is the approach that, for instance, also the CSDDD requires, where forced labor is part of the risks to be identified and to be assessed in the own business area, but also in the supply chain. And we at Prewave also support here this risk-based funnel approach of starting with the scoping, so identifying which broad categories and countries of suppliers are at risk for human rights, but also can be done specifically for forced labor. And then we drive a screening and risk analysis which uses concretely supplier sites to identify whether there's any indications that we can identify in media data, and to then suggest and allow our customers to implement actions to remediate. Now, this is the standard risk-based approach, and it does apply to forced labor due diligence. But because, as Sebastian mentioned, the forced labor regulation flips a bit the script on not just having a best effort approach, but rather an approach where companies are then bound to provide evidence. The due diligence needs to be more thorough and needs to follow, let's say, a specific approach. And this is an approach we have developed together with Löning, and this is a collaboration we have, out of which also this report that Markus mentioned earlier came out, and that we've also applied to already real cases with real customers, and it follows, let's say, the standard identify, classify, prioritize, respond framework. But we see this as really a proactive approach that allows you to identify and remediate risks before they turn into problems that you see at customs or with authorities. Because, as Sebastian mentioned, once there is a suspension by the authority, you only have a very short time frame to respond to these suspensions. So let's start. We start with identifying. This is where we apply AI-driven media screening. In this particular case, a very localized approach focused on identifying these ILO indicators of forced labor in local data sources using local search terms, understanding local context. This research also has a special verification loop at the end. And it produces, on the one hand, alerts within the system where we can highlight for companies and for suppliers whether there's any indications around these forced labor risks. Some of these cases have also found their way into this report we published together with Löning. These alerts, they come with a source document that is also going beyond what we typically do at Prewave, where we purely link out to the relevant news media. Here we also provide a first indication as to why this indication of forced labor has been flagged within Prewave. And this approach allows us to apply what we call a proactive mitigation approach. Reactive means following the due diligence and identifying and remediating cases that are already known. So we have, out of experience with other regulatory regimes, such as in the US, already companies that have been sanctioned, that have been quote unquote blacklisted by authorities. There has been reports that are public which are naming companies. This is what we call reactive because then it's already public, it's already known, and companies need to then address these ex post. What we are here doing is building up a database of cases that are not yet public but can be used to remediate. And this is what we call the proactive approach. So working with cases before they have been officially sanctioned or officially publicized. And yeah, 10 of these cases have been included in this report. And now showing here a case study that kind of encapsulates and then demonstrates the value of this proactive approach. So we published this report in March of 2025 based on indications that reached back to 2015 for a particular company, Eltec. And this company was then on May 29th of 2025 named in Spiegel and New York Times reports as being linked to forced labor. So this is, let's say, an example of being able to see risks before they are publicized and obviously giving customers then the relevant time to mitigate. Of course, these identification that within the Prewave system are created as alerts are just that. They are certainly not proof of forced labor, but rather just indications. And that's why a detailed case review with experts like Löning is necessary. And if you read the report, this is exactly how you see each case is structured. We first give an indication and provide sources, but then there is this in-depth assessment from Löning, also understanding the context and providing a risk level based on the totality of sources and the context around this case. So with these cases, and I've mentioned now there's several hundreds of these cases that we have identified. Um, it's then still a question of, well, is this a direct supplier or is this a tier 2, tier 3, tier 4 supplier? So how close am I to that risk? And this is where we offer what's called an exposure analysis. So we can highlight in the deeper supply chain of companies whether there is such a exposed company present and where that is. Is it in the tier 1, tier 2, or tier 3? This is based on our supply chain mapping capability, where we can, purely based on the tier 1 suppliers that we are provided by customers, can then open up the transparency into the deeper supply chain and then highlight whether we find here an exposed company, meaning we have these indications on forced labor risk in the tier 1, tier 2, or beyond. And then if there's really a case and it's a strong case and it's close, it's on your tier 1, it's on your tier 2, and you want to engage and you want to remediate, that is then again where somebody like Löning can really support with bespoke advisory and consulting as to how to really address and remediate these particular cases. And this really closes the loop from identifying to assessing and classifying, prioritizing and understanding where these cases are in the supply chain, to then really responding and remediating. And ideally, that is then a motion that companies run continuously, so that when, let's say, an authority suspends a particular shipment or issues a suspension, that you are already prepared, you can already respond. And that is really what we've also seen based on experience with customers around the US regulation. Responding within 30 or 60 days is I wouldn't say an impossibility, but it is very hard to gather the evidence from the supply chain. So yeah, with that, I would like to thank you for participating. We have 1 minute until 6, so really on the spot. Thank you, Sebastian and Markus. I think you've not just presented well, but you've also been busy answering all the questions in the Q&A section. So thank you so much
Just
for that.
one question left, which I don't understand. So I think we answered them all.
Yeah. So maybe that is a question to Prewave based on the supply chain mapping. So yes, we use customs data as part of the supply chain mapping, but that is just one source we use. It could also be that we see a relationship in media data, for instance, so that one company is working with another company. So there are several ways. It's not just imports. But yeah, Sebastian, maybe the question was also more, when is this applied from the authorities? Because we have, let's say, the act of placing a product on the market, right, which can be within the European market, but it can also be from an import. So when is sort of the trigger for the authorities to act?
Yeah, well, probably in a lot of cases, the customs authorities suspend the products coming into the European Union, the products where the authorities indicated to customs there is forced labor or alleged forced labor in the products. But of course, it could also be the case that the products already entered the European Union, and then the authorities come to the conclusion those are connected with forced labor. In that cases, there might be market bans and suspensions also for the products already entered the EU.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you, Sebastian. I think no more questions at this point from the audience. I think we covered a lot of ground today, and certainly won't have been the last webinar on this topic because, as mentioned in the beginning, it is now, let's say, one of the next legislations that is really applying to companies ahead of also the CSDDD. So I think it is something that will gain in priority and importance over the next couple of months. Yeah.
But potentially has a big impact, financial impact for companies,
Yes.
business impact. And I think the more companies realize that, if your product is seized at the border, it has an impact on business relations. Your banks is going to start asking things. So the impact is incredible of this. And that's, I think, the most important thing for companies to realize, the potential impact of this regulation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Mm.
Well, thank you, Markus. Thank you, Sebastian, for taking the time.
Thank you.
I guess I can only say we will send out the slides and the report and the video to everybody who registered and participated. And yeah, I guess until next time. Yeah, thank you so much.